Thank you. Director Pagel, in your testimony, you were mentioning several specific things that you would like to see in the bill. It wasn't clear to me if you were commenting on points that have already been incorporated or points that you think still need to be incorporated.
These are points that we think still need to be incorporated, and we're looking forward to working with the sponsors, you all on the committee, and Chris and others to make sure that any Good Samaritan legislation is really protective. You know, we're working directly with communities on the ground who have been impacted by mine waste or mining, and we would just want to make sure that downstream communities, especially Indigenous communities, are adequately protected and that there's not some unintended consequences. Earthworks, Chris was reminding me that the first time we testified together on this issue supporting Good Samaritan liability relief was 2006. Not that much has changed, except maybe now I wear these reading glasses. But you know, the liability relief that Good Samaritans want is something that we support and want to work to make sure that any bill that passes gives that liability relief, but also really protects water and communities on the ground.
Thank you. And Director Wood, it's been mentioned that that you've been engaged in this conversation for a long time, and the earlier testimony said this was first looked at in the early 1990s. What has been the primary concern that has prevented this from becoming law previously?
Senator, I think it goes back to something I suggested earlier. The Clean Water Act and CERCLA are two of our most important environmental laws, and I think people have been concerned that we would somehow use this effort to weaken those bedrock environmental laws. And I think another issue is that people were concerned about the scope and the scale of permitting a Good Samaritan program writ large. And while I agree with Jim that we do need to do that, ultimately the beauty of this bill is that it's 15 pilots over 7 years. And so we can actually learn from the work over the next 15 years and then take those lessons learned and apply it more broadly.
I'm trying to remember the details, and I'm not remembering them of a previous environmental accident. And I wasn't sure if it happened during an attempted remediation, but I think it was a mine that was full of water that was contaminated that was released into a stream and caused some devastation. Can you remind us of that, and how do we avoid that, something like that happening again?
So that was I think that was the Animus. I mean, it happens every day, to be clear. It's happening on tens of thousands of abandoned mines. But on that one, there was a cleanup. An EPA's, a contractor to the EPA, I believe, that was cleaning up some big adits that were plugged, and they gave. But it's important that kind of a cleanup, that's not these. We're talking about lower risk projects, not projects that would qualify for Superfund cleanup. These are mostly tailings piles or draining adits, which are much smaller in scope and scale.
And Ms. Pagel, is that the kind of thing that it's in your mind when you're concerned about potential downstream impacts?
Yes, there's always, I think the focus on low-risk projects and the pilot projects is great and will hopefully mitigate anything like the Gold King mine disaster in Colorado happening. But just, things do go wrong, and just making sure that there's adequate protection if water quality is made significantly worse than it was previously is something that we remain concerned about, and we want to make sure that there are adequate protections to ensure that doesn't happen.
And Director Wood, you mentioned that that particular disaster involved unplugging something. I didn't catch what it was you were talking about.
Adits, holes. I think they were doing some drilling to relieve pressure from these adits, and I don't exactly know the details of what happened there, but it was a much more larger scale engineering project than the 15 pilots that are contemplated in this bill.
And Director Augsbury, if we do nothing, if we don't have this bill, is it fair to say that very few remediation projects will take place?
I believe that's so. As Chris has mentioned, we've got two big impediments, which are funding and liability protection. Congress has started to address the funding issue, and that can really be unlocked with the Good Samaritan protections anticipated by S 3571. And I would just add that we're talking about the Gold King mining disaster, and although that wasn't the kind of site that would be subject to this legislation, it did demonstrate to the public the dangers that these mines present, and really the acute economic impacts. Fisheries were closed, recreation along the Animas came to a standstill. It's a very river-dependent economy in that area. And I know fishermen were loath to get back because of the contamination, but more typically, acid mine drainage has diffuse economic impacts over long periods of time. Contaminated water is more expensive for municipalities to clean up, to treat to drinkable water standards. Agricultural producers suffer reduced crop yields when they're irrigating with contaminated water, and it also harms those aquatic ecosystems essential to good fishing and hunting and birding. So I would hope that inaction is not an option.
Director Augsburg, just to be absolutely clear, these are abandoned mines. This is not a situation where a company that has been involved in a mine still has liability, still is, reachable, could transfer a mine to a nonprofit and avoid being responsible for the challenges they may have created.
That is my understanding of the legislation, yes, sir.